I used to believe that love, once promised, could survive anything. I believed that if a woman gave enough of herself, her time, her patience, her silence, then one day it would all be returned to her as respect. I believed that marriage was built on endurance, that motherhood meant self-erasure, and that if I just tried harder, spoke softer, and asked for less, everything would eventually feel right. These beliefs didn't come from nowhere. They were taught to me slowly, carefully over years until they felt like truth. And by the time I realized they were lies, my life no longer felt like my own. When I married my husband, everyone around me said I was fortunate. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and admired in social circles. He knew how to carry himself in public, how to command a room without raising his voice. People listened when he spoke. They respected him. And because they respected him, they assumed he must be a good man at home as well. I assumed the same. In the beginning, he was attentive enough to make me feel chosen, not deeply loved, but selected, approved of, claimed. At the time, that felt like enough. After the wedding, things changed quietly, not all at once, not in ways that were obvious or dramatic. He didn't shout, he didn't hit, he didn't insult me outright. What he did was more subtle and far more damaging. He corrected me in front of others with a smile. He dismissed my opinions as impractical. He made decisions without consulting me and then acted surprised when I seemed hurt. Over time, I learned that my role was not to contribute, but to comply. I told myself this was normal. I told myself all marriages had adjustments. I told myself love matured into something calmer, quieter, less demanding. What I didn't realize was that love was being replaced by control and partnership by hierarchy. When our son Ryan was born, I thought everything would change. I thought a child would soften the sharp edges of our life, that parenthood would teach him tenderness. For a short while, I was hopeful. He held the baby carefully. He spoke proudly to others about becoming a father. But inside our home, the atmosphere shifted again. Ryan wasn't treated like a child who needed guidance. He was treated like a standard that had to be met. From the very beginning, my husband spoke about strength, discipline, achievement. Crying was discouraged. Mistakes were highlighted. Praise was rare and conditional. When Ryan took his first steps, I clapped and cried with joy. My husband simply nodded and said, "About time." When Ryan struggled with schoolwork, I sat beside him patiently, explaining again and again. My husband stood in the doorway, watching, and later told me I was making him weak by being too gentle. Whenever I tried to defend my son, I became the problem. "You're emotional." He would say, "You don't understand how the world works. You're raising him wrong." Slowly, the space for my voice disappeared. I spoke less. I questioned myself more. I started measuring every word before I said it, calculating whether it was worth the sigh, the look, the quiet disapproval that would follow. I told myself I was being mature. In reality, I was shrinking. Ryan grew and he watched everything. At first, he was attached to me. He followed me from room to room, asked questions, laughed easily. When his father spoke harshly, Ryan would glance at me, searching my face for reassurance. I gave it to him every time. I smiled when my heart ached. I whispered comfort when no one else was listening. I thought that was enough to protect him. I was wrong. Children learn not only from love, but from power. And in our house, power did not belong to me. As Ryan grew older, I noticed small changes. He stopped asking for my help and started asking for permission instead. He began to mirror his father's tone, short, dismissive, impatient. When I corrected him gently, he rolled his eyes. When I asked him to help around the house, he acted inconvenienced. I told myself it was just adolescence. I told myself all teenagers rebel. But deep down, I knew something darker was happening. The two of them began to form a quiet alliance. They shared conversations I wasn't part of, plans I wasn't included in, laughter that stopped when I entered the room. I would bring tea into the living room and feel like an intruder in my own home. Sometimes I caught fragments of their conversations, discussions about money, about the future, about decisions that affected all of us, decisions that were already made. One evening, I overheard something that changed me forever. I had gone to bed early, exhausted, emotionally and physically drained in ways I couldn't explain. I realized I had left my phone charging in the living room and went to retrieve it quietly. They didn't hear me approaching. She doesn't get it, my husband said calmly, almost casually. Ryan laughed under his breath. Yeah, she's just there. Just there, not my name, not my role, not mother, not wife, just there, like furniture. Like a background object that existed without purpose. I stood frozen in the hallway, my chest tight, my hands shaking. Neither of them noticed. I went back to the bedroom and closed the door silently. That night, I didn't cry. I stared at the ceiling until morning, replaying those words over and over, feeling something inside me fracture in a way that could never fully heal. After that, everything felt different. I began to notice how often I was excluded, how rarely I was acknowledged, how easily my presence was ignored. If I was sad, I was dramatic. If I was quiet, I was sulking. If I tried to speak, I was interrupting. There was no version of me that fit anymore. The arguments became quieter but colder. He didn't need to raise his voice. His disappointment was enough. When I expressed loneliness, he accused me of being ungrateful. When I asked for connection, he said I was demanding. Ryan watched these exchanges with a strange detachment, as if he had already decided which side he was on. Years passed like this. Years I can barely remember clearly because survival leaves little room for memory. I stayed because I was afraid of being alone, afraid of losing my son completely, afraid of confirming everything they believed about me, that I was weak, dependent, incapable. I told myself that staying was sacrifice. That sacrifice was love. The day my husband told me he wanted a divorce, there was no anger in his voice, no emotion at all. He spoke as if he were discussing a business decision that had simply stopped being profitable. "This isn't working anymore," he said. "I think it's better if we move on." Ryan stood nearby, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He didn't look at me. He didn't ask me anything. He didn't defend me. In that moment, I realized something devastating. I had already lost them long before this conversation ever happened. I signed the papers with a numbness I didn't know was possible. I walked out of that house carrying only what I was allowed to take. No one stopped me, no one followed, no one asked if I was okay. As I closed the door behind me, I believed I was walking away from the worst pain of my life. I had no idea that this ending was only the beginning, and that one day the same people who erased me would stand before me, begging for forgiveness they might never deserve. The first night after the divorce, I didn't sleep at all. I lay on a narrow mattress in a small, unfamiliar apartment, staring at a ceiling stained with age, listening to sounds that didn't belong to me. Cars passed outside. Someone argued in the distance. A dog barked endlessly, as if it, too, had been abandoned. My suitcase sat unopened in the corner, like a reminder that this wasn't a temporary stay. This was my life now. For the first time in decades, there was no one else's routine to follow, no expectations waiting for me in the morning. And yet, instead of relief, all I felt was fear. Thick, suffocating fear. I had left a house, but I hadn't yet left the version of myself that house had created. The silence was the hardest part. During my marriage, silence had always been tense, heavy with unspoken judgment. Now it was empty, wide, and unfamiliar. I didn't know what to do with it. I kept expecting my phone to ring, expecting a message from my son asking where I was, or a call from my husband demanding something I had forgotten. Nothing came. Hours passed, then days. The absence of their voices felt louder than their cruelty ever had. I began to realize something terrifying. If I didn't move forward on my own, no one was coming to pull me out of this. Money became my first reality check. During my marriage, I had managed the household but never controlled it. Decisions were made for me. Accounts were explained to me, never shared. After the divorce, I received just enough to survive, not enough to feel secure. For the first time, I had to face the world not as someone's wife, not as someone's mother, but as myself, and I had no idea who that person was supposed to be. I searched for work quietly, almost shamefully, as if I were doing something wrong. My confidence was brittle. Interviews terrified me. Every question felt like a test I hadn't studied for. "What are your strengths?" I wanted to laugh. Strengths. I had been trained for years to believe I had none. "Why should we hire you?" "Because I exist," I wanted to say. "Because I need to survive." Eventually, I found a job. It wasn't impressive. It didn't come with praise or prestige, but it came with a paycheck and something even more valuable, structure. A reason to wake up, a place where my presence was expected. The first few weeks I spoke very little. I observed, I listened, I followed instructions carefully, terrified of making mistakes. But something unexpected happened. No one snapped at me, no one rolled their eyes when I asked a question. No one told me I was being emotional. When I completed tasks, people thanked me. When I stayed late to help, they noticed that alone felt unreal. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my body began to relax. My shoulders dropped. My breathing changed. I started sleeping through the night, not peacefully, but without panic. I began to realize how much of my anxiety had come from living under constant judgment. Outside of work, life was still difficult. Evenings were the worst. I would come home, cook simple meals, eat alone, and then sit in silence, my thoughts circling the same painful questions. Did my son miss me at all? Did he ever think about how easily he let me go? Or had he already replaced me in his mind with someone stronger, louder, more deserving? I tried calling Ryan once, just once. The phone rang for a long time before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I stared at the screen for several minutes afterward, feeling foolish for expecting anything different. That night, I cried harder than I had since the divorce. Not because he hadn't answered, but because I finally understood that love, when starved long enough, doesn't always survive. Weeks turned into months. As my routine settled, so did something else, clarity. Distance has a strange way of sharpening memory. Moments I had ignored or excused during my marriage came back to me with painful detail. The dismissive comments, the constant criticism, the way my opinions had been treated as inconveniences. The way my son had learned little by little to see me through his father's eyes. I stopped blaming myself for everything, not all at once. Guilt doesn't disappear easily when it's been planted for years. But cracks began to form in the story I had been telling myself, that I wasn't enough, that I had failed, that I deserved to be discarded. At work, I began to speak more. I offered ideas. I volunteered for responsibilities. When problems came up, people turned to me for solutions. Each time that happened, it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been taken without my consent. I started to remember who I was before I had learned to be quiet. Meanwhile, my old life didn't disappear. It watched me from a distance. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard fragments, nothing direct, nothing apologetic, just pieces. My husband was overwhelmed. Managing everything alone wasn't as simple as he had imagined. Ryan was struggling. Angry, withdrawn, lashing out at school. The house felt colder, people said, tense. Without me there was no buffer, no quiet absorber of frustration. Still, neither of them reached out. And that hurt more than I expected. I realized then that their silence wasn't accidental. It was pride. It was entitlement. They believed I would break first, that I would come back, that I would apologize for leaving. They believed, as they always had, that I needed them more than they needed me. They were wrong. One evening, after a particularly long day, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and paused. The woman staring back at me looked older, but also steadier. There was exhaustion in her eyes, yes, but there was something else too, awareness, resolve. I barely recognized her, and yet, for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of respect. I wasn't thriving yet. But I was no longer disappearing. I didn't know it then, but the balance had already begun to shift. The life I was building, quietly, painfully, was forcing the past to confront its own emptiness. And soon the people who once ignored my pain would realize that the woman they had dismissed was the very foundation they had been standing on. When they finally came looking for me, it wouldn't be out of love. It would be out of loss. Life has a strange way of testing you just when you begin to believe you might finally be standing on your own feet. Just as I started to feel some balance returning to my days, the past began to reach for me again. Not directly, not honestly, but through cracks it had left behind. It started subtly. A message from an unknown number asking if I was doing okay. No name. No apology, just those two words heavy with assumptions. I stared at the screen for a long time before deleting it. A few days later, another message followed. This time it was clearer. It was my husband. He didn't say he missed me. He didn't ask how I had been surviving. He simply said that things were complicated and that Ryan had been difficult lately, as if those words alone explained years of silence. As if I was expected to step back into my old role the moment things became uncomfortable for them. I didn't reply. That choice, simple as it sounds, felt revolutionary. For most of my life, I had responded immediately to their needs, their discomforts, their demands. Now I chose myself, and in that silence something shifted. I felt fear, yes, but beneath it I felt power, quiet, steady power. At work, my world continued to expand. Responsibilities grew, trust followed. I was given projects that required judgment, leadership, and confidence, qualities I had been told for years I lacked. Each completed task strengthened something inside me. My voice grew firmer, my posture changed. Even the way I walked felt different, as if my body itself was remembering how to exist without apology. One afternoon, a colleague confided in me about her own failing marriage. As she spoke, her voice trembling, I realized she was looking at me not with pity, but with respect. She saw me as someone who had survived, someone who had chosen herself. That moment stayed with me long after she walked away. For the first time, my pain felt like it had meaning beyond suffering. Meanwhile, the cracks in my former life widened. Ryan finally called. His voice sounded unfamiliar, lower, sharper, strained. He didn't ask how I was. He accused me of leaving. He said I had abandoned him. Each word hit like a blow, because part of me still wanted to protect him, to explain, to soften the truth. But another part of me, the part that had been silent for too long, finally spoke. I told him I hadn't left him. I told him I had left a place where I no longer existed. I told him that love doesn't survive contempt and that a mother is still a human being. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice cracked, not with anger, but with confusion. And for the first time, I heard something new in his tone, doubt. After that call, he didn't contact me again. But I knew something had shifted. Seeds of truth, once planted, don't disappear easily. My husband, on the other hand, grew more persistent. Messages turned into calls. Calls turned into long, awkward silences where he seemed to wait for me to reassure him, to fix what he had broken. He spoke about stress, about pressure, about how hard things were without me. Not once did he ask what it had been like for me all those years. Not once did he acknowledge the damage that told me everything I needed to know. I began to understand a painful truth. They didn't miss me because they loved me. They missed me because I had made their lives easier. I had absorbed their frustration, softened their failures, carried their emotional weight without complaint. And now that weight had nowhere to go, as weeks passed, I noticed something else changing. My relationship with guilt, it no longer controlled me. I stopped questioning whether I had done the right thing. I stopped rewriting the past to excuse their behavior. Instead, I allowed myself to feel anger, not explosive anger, but focused, clarifying anger, the kind that burns away illusion. I started doing things just for myself. Small things at first, walking in the evenings without rushing, buying clothes I liked, not clothes meant to disappear into the background, saying no without explanation. Each act felt like reclaiming stolen ground. One evening, as I sat alone watching the city lights from my apartment window, my phone rang again. This time it was different. My husband's voice sounded unsteady. He said Ryan was struggling badly, that he wasn't listening, that he blamed himself, that he asked about me more than he admitted. For a brief moment, my heart softened. Maternal instinct surged strong and familiar, but then I remembered the years of silence, the years of dismissal, the years when my pain had been inconvenient. I told him I hoped Ryan would find clarity. I told him I wished them peace, and then I ended the call. That night, I didn't cry. I realized then that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be cheap. It would not be begged for and granted out of fear. It would require truth, accountability, and change, things they had never been forced to face before. Unbeknownst to them, my life was no longer paused, waiting for their return. It was moving forward, gaining shape and strength, and soon circumstances would force them to confront a reality they had never imagined, one where I was no longer the woman they could ignore, dismiss, or control. When that moment came, the power dynamic they had relied on for years would collapse, and they would finally understand what it meant to lose me. By the time the second year after the divorce began, I realized something profound had changed inside me. I no longer woke up with a tight knot of fear in my chest. I no longer replayed old conversations in my head, wondering what I could have said differently to make myself more acceptable, more tolerable, more loved. The past still existed, but it no longer controlled my breathing. It had become something I could look at from a distance. Still painful, but no longer powerful. My life had developed a rhythm that belonged to me alone. Mornings were quiet and intentional. I chose what to wear, what to eat, how to begin my day, without bracing myself for judgment. At work, my responsibilities had grown steadily. People trusted me, not because I was silent or obedient, but because I was consistent, thoughtful, and capable. Each day I was reminded, in small but undeniable ways, that the version of me my husband and son had dismissed was never the truth. It had only been a convenient lie. The irony was hard to ignore. The strength they once resented was now the very thing shaping my independence. News from my former life reached me whether I wanted it to or not. Friends spoke cautiously, as if unsure how much I wanted to hear. My husband was struggling, not financially. He had always known how to manage money, but emotionally, without me absorbing the tension of the household, every conflict echoed louder. Ryan had grown increasingly distant from him. Arguments escalated quickly now, with no one stepping in to soften words or redirect anger. The house, once orderly and controlled, had become unstable. For the first time, I understood something clearly. I had been the emotional foundation of that home, and once removed, everything built on top of me began to crack. Ryan's next call came late one evening. I almost didn't answer. There was still a part of me that feared slipping back into old patterns, feared mistaking guilt for love, but I answered anyway. His voice was quieter than I remembered. Less certain, he spoke slowly, choosing his words as if afraid they might collapse under their own weight. He told me he was confused, angry, that nothing felt solid anymore, that he didn't understand why everything felt worse instead of better now that I was gone. I told him something I had never said before. I told him that emotional safety isn't loud, it isn't controlling, it isn't built on fear or authority. It's built on respect and consistency and listening. I told him that living in a home where one person absorbs all the pain doesn't make others stronger. It makes them dependent. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was unsteady. He said he had never thought of it that way. That was the first time I felt something shift between us. Not healing, not forgiveness, but awareness. My husband reached out more frequently after that. His messages were longer now, heavier with implication. He spoke about exhaustion, about loneliness, about how much pressure he felt. He mentioned Ryan often, as if hoping the shared concern would pull me closer. But what stood out to me most was what he still didn't say. He didn't acknowledge the years of dismissal. He didn't name the harm. He spoke as if circumstances, not choices, had led us here. When he finally asked to meet, I agreed. Not because I missed him, and not because I hoped for reconciliation, but because I wanted to see who he was without the version of me that once stabilized his world. We met in a quiet public place, neutral and unremarkable. When I saw him walk in, I barely recognized him. He looked older, more worn down, less certain of his own authority. He tried to speak confidently, but his words faltered. He talked about regret, about stress, about how he never imagined things would turn out this way. He said he missed the way things used to be. I listened carefully, the way I always had, but this time I wasn't absorbing his emotions. I was observing them. When he finished, I told him calmly that missing comfort is not the same as missing a person. I told him that stability built on someone else's silence is not love. I told him that I had rebuilt my life piece by piece, and I would not dismantle it to return to a role that erased me. For the first time since I had known him, he had no argument. No correction, no dismissal, just silence. I left that meeting with an unexpected sense of peace. Not long after, Ryan came to see me in person. He stood at my door awkwardly, no longer the confident boy who once mirrored his father's certainty. He looked unsure of where to place his hands, how to stand, how to begin. When I invited him in, he sat rigidly, eyes scanning the small apartment that represented a life he had never imagined for me. A life that existed without either of them at its center. He spoke haltingly at first, then faster, words spilling out as if held back for too long. He talked about guilt, about memories resurfacing, about moments he now replayed differently, times he had stayed silent when he shouldn't have, times he had laughed along instead of defending me. His voice broke when he admitted that he hadn't realized how much I had done until no one was left to do it. "I didn't hate you," he said quietly. "I just didn't see you." That confession hurt more than anger ever could, but it also held the seed of truth. When he asked me if I could forgive him, I didn't answer immediately. I told him forgiveness isn't a single moment or a spoken word. It's a process built on accountability and change. I told him that love doesn't mean returning to what harms you. I told him that if we were going to have a relationship, it would have to be new, honest, and respectful. He nodded, tears slipping down his face, and for the first time, I didn't rush to comfort him. I let him sit with his emotions because growth requires discomfort. After he left, I stood alone in my apartment and felt something I hadn't expected. Pride not in them, but in myself. I had survived erasure. I had rebuilt from nothing. And now the people who once dismissed my worth were standing at the edge of my new life, realizing too late that I was never weak. They had begged for forgiveness, yes, but more than that, they were finally forced to confront the truth they had avoided for years, and I was no longer afraid of what came next. The years after my divorce had transformed me in ways I could never have imagined while trapped in that house of silence. I was no longer the woman who measured her worth by the approval of others. I was someone who had endured betrayal, humiliation, and invisibility, and had survived. Each morning I woke with a purpose that belonged to me alone. Each choice I made, no matter how small, was mine. Every success, every moment of clarity, every act of self-respect was a brick in the foundation of a life I had built from scratch. The first sign that my past could no longer dominate me came unexpectedly. Ryan arrived at my door one afternoon, hesitant and unsure. He had grown taller, more solemn, and carried a weight I recognized immediately. The arrogance of youth was gone. What remained was the realization of all the mistakes he had inherited from his father's example. He didn't rush into my arms. He didn't demand attention or forgiveness. Instead, he sat down across from me, awkward and fragile, as if testing whether I was still the woman who had been silent for decades. He began to speak slowly, haltingly. He told me about his struggles in school, his anger, his feelings of guilt, and the emptiness he had felt in our home without me. He admitted that he hadn't truly seen me before, that he had taken my presence for granted, dismissed my efforts, and mirrored his father's coldness. Listening to him, I felt the sharp sting of those lost years. But beneath the pain, there was something else, a seed of understanding. For the first time, Ryan saw me as a person, not just a mother, not just someone to serve as a buffer, not just someone to be ignored. When he finally asked, almost in a whisper, "Can you forgive me?" I realized how far I had come. I told him that forgiveness is not a single act or a word. It is a process built on accountability, awareness, and change. I told him that love alone cannot erase years of neglect, and that if we were to rebuild a relationship, it had to be honest, respectful, and rooted in understanding. He listened, tears in his eyes, absorbing for the first time what it truly meant to respect another human being. My husband's reckoning came soon after. He called me hesitantly, asking to meet. The man who had once wielded authority with such certainty now sounded uncertain, diminished, almost afraid. He admitted regret and confessed that he had underestimated the consequences of his actions. We met in a neutral place, away from the memories and control he had once exerted over me. He spoke, attempting to justify, explain, or plead for forgiveness, but I listened without interruption. Calmly, I told him what he needed to hear. Regret without accountability is meaningless, and apology without change is empty. I had rebuilt a life from the ground up, and I would not dismantle it to make him comfortable. For the first time, he had nothing to say. The silence between us was heavy with the realization that the woman he had tried to erase was no longer dependent, no longer fragile, no longer invisible. He understood at last that the years he had spent dismissing my worth were irretrievable. The freedom I felt after that encounter was unlike anything I had experienced in decades. Not revenge, not spite, but a deep, unwavering sense of triumph. I had endured invisibility, humiliation, and betrayal, and had emerged not only intact but stronger. I had learned that strength does not come from dominance or control, but from endurance, self-respect, and the courage to walk away. Ryan's relationship with me grew gradually after that day. He began to understand that respect and accountability are the foundations of trust. He learned that independence does not mean abandoning love, and that recognizing mistakes and taking responsibility is more meaningful than empty words or gestures. Each conversation with him reminded me that even in the years of pain, growth is possible when nurtured by resilience and clarity. I had been hated, I had been dismissed, I had been made to feel invisible in the two people's lives I had given everything to. Yet now, standing in my apartment in the life I had painstakingly built, I realized something extraordinary. I was no longer waiting for their approval, their recognition, or their love. I was free. I was seen not because they had noticed, but because I had claimed my presence, my worth, and my power. The people who had begged for my forgiveness finally understood something they had never comprehended before, that I was never weak, and my absence had never been a void to be filled. It was a space reclaimed. The woman they had dismissed, belittled, and attempted to control was no longer a victim. She was whole, unshakable, and unafraid, and in that final truth I found peace. The life they had tried to erase was now mine fully, without compromise or apology. The love I offered, the forgiveness I could give, and the boundaries I maintained were mine to decide. I had survived, I had grown, and in the end I had won, not by demanding recognition, not by punishing them, but simply by existing, thriving, and reclaiming everything they had tried to take from me. I was no longer invisible, I was unbreakable, and the freedom that comes from truly knowing your own worth is a victory no one else can take away.